And good morning once again. Welcome, Wyoming. Back with Economist Sven Larson with Americans for Tax Reform. Am I right, Sven?
Yes.
You're an economist, well known also from your work previously with the Wyoming Liberty Group.
Yes, but I'm now with Americans for Tax Reform.
And we wanted to talk about some likely upcoming proposals in the Wyoming State Legislature, which, by the way, is now less than a month away. It's a budget session. And one thing that we wanted to chat about right off the get-go is a possible corporate income tax. Tell us what's going on with that.
Oh, wow. This one's been in the making for a long time. I think it's the third version of it we're seeing now. It started out as a gross receipts tax. Then that one died, and a legislator, an important legislator whose name I'm not going to mention, sent me an email, which I still have, saying that ship has sailed. It is never coming back again. Well, guess what? Last session, we saw it again in the form of a corporate income tax. They modified it after they lost last session. They modified it, and it came back in the form where it's called tax recapture. So that's where we are now. It's a 7% rate that would be paid by the previous version said only corporations with more than 100 shareholders within retail and I believe it was accommodations and restaurants. Now they've taken the industry classification away, so it's the only restriction on it now is 100 shareholders or more.
So basically it's just a corporate income tax on larger companies.
Yes, and you know that the restriction, the shareholder restriction is going to go away after a while, so all corporations would be paying it.
Are you concerned that this might be the camel's nose under the tent for a statewide income tax?
Absolutely. I have no doubt. If you look at the last page of that bill, they define the taxpayer by their IRS filing status. All they need to do, and I think that's intentional, because all they need to do then is essentially add the 1040 tax filing status and you have a personal income tax. Now, if they do that, it would be tied to the 7% rate or whatever rate in the future is on the corporate side. But there are states that do this, have a kind of calibrate the two. Not many, but there are examples of it. And I would not be surprised if that is exactly how they're doing it. By saying first, I predicted this back in 2016 already when I first heard rumors of an income tax.
We've been hearing about this for years.
Exactly, and you have too, absolutely. What I predicted back then was that they would start with the corporate side, because once you have a corporate income tax, you can go to people and say, well, the big corporations are now paying their, it's time for you to chip in as well. It's a lot easier. I mean, emotions are used very often in politics to get unpopular things done. So if this one goes through, it is not going to stop where it is. There's another reason why it would expand into the personal income tax also, is that corporations obviously are not private individuals, but there are individuals who run businesses that compete with corporations. So if you have an LLC, for example, you file under the personal income tax. So if you don't have to pay an income tax, but the corporation you're competing with has to do that, somebody could make the argument that's unfair. We have to level the playing field. And the way they're going to do it at that point, of course, is to introduce a tax on the individual side.
Do you think that's the end game here?
Oh, yeah. I mean,
is that a conscious thing that they're doing to incorporate an income tax?
Yes. I do believe that there are people in the legislature, far from all of them, but I do believe there are people in the legislature who reason along those lines. That I've been in this fight for 11 years, Doug, and I've spent the last 3.5 years exclusively focusing on fighting tax increases. And all my experience says that there is a long-term concerted effort at raising taxes. We've seen tax proposals for the past several years in the hundreds of millions if you tally them up. That is not a coincidence. It doesn't just happen. There is an intentional strategy behind it. They've tried so many different ways. Let me give you an example that ties into this. 3.5 years ago, when I first testified about Taxmageddon to the Revenue and Appropriations Committees, they laughed at me and said, no, we don't have any problem that we're going to solve with tax hikes. You're crazy. Go away. 3 months after my testimonies that summer of 2016, leading legislators start going out in media saying, oh yeah, we have a huge deficit, we need to raise taxes to do this, and guess what, we're going to pay for the schools with it, because otherwise your kids are going to run around in empty hallways with no teachers, and they're going to starve to death. That was essentially the sentiment that they presented. It was an emotional way to try to sell higher taxes. That is exactly the way they're going to do it here again. And there's a bill already on file that I can tie into this. We can get back to that in a second. But yes, this is a long-term strategy. We've seen them try gross receipts, corporate income tax, higher property taxes, higher sales taxes, higher excise taxes.
There's been talk of bringing the sales tax on groceries back at times.
I do believe that we're going to see, the Revenue Committee doesn't seem to want to move yet on filing bills, but we know the corporate income tax is coming. We know the lodging tax is coming. I believe the sales tax is going to come back again. If they do what they've done the previous years, they're going to pop these up right before the deadline and throw them in and try to make sure people don't see them. You got the property. There are two different versions of property taxes. As late as this fall, they tried again. The leadership of the Revenue Committee tried to get a property tax increase on the corporate side through. They've tried to get either raise the percentage or get more millings and do it on the personal side, the corporate side. It is coming back.
Okay, I'm speaking with economist Sven Larson with Americans for Tax Reform. We'll be back with more right after these words. 650 KGAB, Cheyenne's #1 news talk radio station. You're in tune with Weekend in Wyoming. We have economist Sven Larson with Americans for Tax Reform. We're talking about some likely proposals coming up in the upcoming legislative session to increase revenues. If you have any questions or comments, phone lines are open, 632-6500, 632-3323. Sven, just this week on KGAB.com, we posted an article about a bill that would pave the way eventually for a toll road on Interstate 80. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, there is a bill on file already, SF6, to create a tolling authority. Now, there are two ways to slice this, and I'm for it and against it, depending on how you slice it.
Okay.
You can do it as a revenue reform, which means you simply slam it on top of everything else we pay, and that's not the way to do it. Because then, even though a toll, strictly speaking, is not a tax, it effectively becomes a tax and a tax increase, and that is not the way to do it. The way to do it is like a spending reform. You carve out, you take I-80 out of the state budget, out of YDOT, put it as a separate entity, completely separate from the state budget. Then you fund it entirely with tolls.
Enterprise fund, essentially? Is that an enterprise fund, essentially?
Yeah, of sorts. Think of it as a utility that would run entirely on its own revenue. And then what you do is you create an opportunity to lower the taxes that go into to reduce the taxes that fund the rest of YDOT, which means that you give relief back to drivers. Now, I'm not saying I'm for doing it exactly this way, but that is a concept that is worth discussing. The problem with the SF6 that I have is that they're going to place this under YDOT. They're going to have a separate tolling fee account, and there are going to be some safeguards so that you don't take other taxes and plunge it into the tolled highway. But there is nothing that says, as far as I understand the bill, and I got to go back and read it again, but as far as my first reading of it goes, there is nothing that prevents YDOT from milking the toll for using it elsewhere. There could be a safeguard. I want to say this. In the details, there could be a safeguard against it, but it was not apparent when I read the bill. And this concerns me because I think by setting it up as a revenue reform, not a spending reform, they are squandering a great opportunity to start discussing and implementing structural spending reforms that will reduce taxes as we go along.
What's the difference between a revenue reform and a spending reform exactly, for those who don't know?
Well, the revenue reform would simply introduce this and add it. I mean, we're already paying for YDOT, we're paying for the highways through other taxes. This would simply just add to the cost. And that is how they've structured the bill. Because they want to create this under YDOT. But I want them to take I-80 out of away from YDOT. Let YDOT handle the rest. Create something entirely new. Then we could privatize it. We could lease it out to a private company that would operate it. And then the tolls would be this would be like having Black Hills Energy or something run an entirely different operation that has nothing to do with the legislature. Maybe some fundamental legislation, of course, because it is a highway after all, but an absolute minimum of ties between the state and the highway. Then you would be looking at a concept that is interesting and worth talking about.
So if I'm understanding you correctly, and correct me if I'm not, you're kind of concerned about them using this as a cash cow for whatever else.
Yes. And unfortunately, this is sponsored by the Joint Transportation Committee, which means that it carries some clout and it is easier to get it into the session. And I'm glad they're starting to talk about reforming how government operates, but it would be much better if they took a step back and said, let's do it with the purpose of reducing the burden on taxpayers. That would have been a much better approach to this. And I have been in principle a proponent of tolls, but for the reason that you can actually reform spending and cut taxes along the way.
I should mention too, just as a side note, there is some question about imposing a toll road on a federal interstate, so that's something that may have to be hashed out if this moves forward.
Yeah. I just got back from the East Coast, and I have an easy pass that I use when I go on, for example, on the toll roads in Indiana, Pennsylvania, Ohio. Also, if you use the 495 around Washington, you can use that. There is a way to do it, apparently, because they can do it out there. But I understand, too, that there are legal concerns. And since I'm not an expert on that, I'll leave it to the lawyers.
Okay. Sven, just in general terms, what we've been hearing the last few years out of the legislature, and this hasn't changed, is look, we face, and I've heard figures anywhere from $400 million to $1 billion shortfall over the next few years. Coal's going away. It's not coming back is the argument. We've got to impose some new taxes. How would you respond to that?
No, we've got to cut spending.
Can we cut enough spending to balance the budget?
Absolutely, without a doubt. I have on my website, Larson's Political Economy, I have listed 7 different spending reforms that we can do. The big kahuna there is school choice. If we do it the right way, we do ESAs out of Arizona, or we do the vouchers out of Wisconsin or some other model with the same effectiveness, we can cut costs by more than $300 million a year, and we can still educate our kids. They can get an excellent education, and we can get a lot more choice if we also protect homeschoolers so that they can continue unaffected by this, because I know there's a lot of people who want that. Medicaid reform, if we reform long-term Medicaid, if we have vouchers so people can buy their plans, health plans under Medicaid from out of state. I worked with this on this with Colin Simpson when he was Speaker in the House. We can cut costs by at the very least $150 million if we can do that. There are numerous other things we can do. All it takes to get there is an absolute, uncompromising no to any new or higher taxes. Once we take that off the table, we can have a conversation about spending reform.
You mentioned Medicaid. I understand Medicaid expansion is going to be back again for discussion. What are your thoughts on that?
I dread that. That is a boondoggle of major proportions. They say it's not going to cost us. It's a revenue. How is it a revenue source when you spend $100 to get 90? I just don't get that. I would love to hear somebody explain. Maybe Common Core Math can explain that, but I can't get it from. The cost is actually going to be north of $100 million if it plays out the way it does in some other states. The disaster in Montana is very telling. They saw a decline in Medicaid enrollment until they went ahead with Medicaid expansion. Then it flattened out and started increasing again. That is exactly what's going to happen. And we are very vulnerable because we have such a weak market for private insurance here. We would be putting taxpayers on hook for enormous amounts of money if we went ahead with that. And let me tie one thing into that. It's the mental health long-term mental health issue that the governor brought up when he presented his budget. I fear that that is going to be tied into Medicaid and or, especially, this is my real fear, being used as a vehicle to motivate the corporate income tax because the numbers are so close.
Sven, it looks like we have a caller. Good morning, caller. You're on the air.
Good morning, Doug. Good morning, Sven. This is Lisa.
Hey, Lisa.
Hi, Lisa.
Sven, I know you're not with Wyoming Liberty Group anymore, but Glenn's had somebody on his show from there who had gone to a joint committee meeting, and somebody from the hospital actually testified that to what you were just saying, that you spend $100 to get $90.
Yeah.
You know who that was?
I don't know, but that is a very important point, and I'm glad you bring it up. Because once we create Medicaid, once we do Medicaid expansion, it's not just that we have to pay money to get some federal funds. It's also that those federal funds are not reliable over time, and there is a cap for how much they pay. If we get a bigger enrollment that was projected when we created it, we are on the hook for 100% of that excess enrollment. This is why in every state that has created Medicaid expansion, it becomes a huge boondoggle, and all the conversation they have after creating it is on how they can raise taxes.
Sven, as I'm sure you're aware, because we've discussed this issue before, one of the arguments in favor of expansion is our hospitals are forking out $100 million a year for uncompensated care. This would help address that. How do you respond to that?
Let us do two things. First, three things actually. Number one, let's open up Wyoming to private insurance from other states. So anybody, not just Medicaid, but private insurance. You can buy your insurance plan anywhere in the country. Before Obamacare, we had 4,000 insurance providers in the country as a whole. We are slowly clawing our way back to that after this Obamacare debacle. If we can tap into that huge market, people can buy affordable, comprehensive coverage plans on a national market. So that's number one. Number two, what I said before about how to reform Medicaid. Number three, we have a crawling socialization of our hospital industry here in this state. We're slowly moving toward a system where only government would be providing hospital services. That is a cost increase in itself because there is no competition. We need to reform, get the private sector back on all these fronts. That is a way to reduce cost, make sure that more people are covered, and more people can actually pay their hospital bills.
Sven, correct me if I'm wrong, I believe you're a native of Sweden, is that correct, where they have socialized medicine?
Yes.
How did it work there?
It's a disaster. You can, in a state like Wyoming, we would not have a single full-service hospital. You would have to. You might be able to get most of your treatment in the state if you're willing to travel 7 hours. You would be waiting 11 months for a knee replacement surgery. You would be dying waiting for cancer treatment that you can quite easily get here in America today. It's an absolute unmitigated disaster. There are people who have to sit and wait 11 hours at the ERs at Swedish hospitals because there are so few of them.
So do you think socialized medicine is being misrepresented as a panacea in the current presidential campaign?
Oh, without a doubt. I can't get it that they don't even. I mean, I don't think a lot of people aren't willing to do the research on it. No, it is going to bring us to a point where we have to raise taxes by incredible amounts. But we have to be aware at the state level. If we don't do anything, we might by default be creating it here. Medicaid expansion is actually a way to unintentionally create a socialized medicine system of sorts here in Wyoming. It opens the door for it because it becomes convenient for, I mean, we have a lot of small businesses that are struggling to provide benefits for the employers that they have. If you create Medicaid expansion, it's going to create an incentive for employers to dump their employees into that system, and you get a big enrollment increase.
Okay, we'll be back to wrap up with Sven Larson right after this.
Which baby step are you on? Dave Ramsey teaches you how to achieve your personal financial goals. Weekday afternoons at 4 on AM 650 KGAB.
AM 650 KGAB, Cheyenne's #1 news talk radio station. Sven, we have roughly a minute and a half here left of our program. We could have easily done another half hour. We'll have you back again. But any last thoughts for our listeners here on anything that we didn't cover that you really want to talk about?
I want to point to go back to we talked about taxes before. I want to emphasize that don't focus all your attention on the corporate income tax. It's absolutely essential that we stop it, but it's not the only one that is coming. We have the lodging tax. I know there are some people who are for it in the industry. They think it's going to pay for advertising. I respect that argument, but it's a vehicle for raising taxes and take money to for other purposes as well. Then
one of the arguments on the lodging tax is mostly out-of-staters pay it. How would you respond to that?
That is a point that has not been proven. I haven't seen any numbers to prove that. If they have it, I'd be happy to review those numbers. They say the same thing about the gas tax, but there is no way of there's no point of collecting the data you need to make that point, especially about the gas tax. If they have something on the lodging tax, I would like to see it. It's still a tax increase, and the way it's constructed now would put us at we would be one of the highest taxed states as far as lodging goes, if it goes ahead.
Sven, 10 seconds left. Any last thoughts here this morning?
Americans for Tax Reform is the only way to go if you want to fight taxes.
And you have a website, right?
ATR.org, and I have one. Just Google Larson's Political Economy.
Okay. Sven, we have a caller coming in. Unfortunately, this segment is over. We'll have you back once again. Thanks for coming in.
Thank you.